Hello, everybody. My name is Arne Franzen. Welcome to the third community meeting for Conway Park. This is also our first PIP meeting for Conway Park. PIP is a public involvement plan for the park. Today is May 29th. We are at the Public Safety Building in Union Square, and just wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for all the staff and officials who have joined us as well. We'll explain more about the PIP meeting in just a minute, but very briefly, it just means it's a specification for a series of actions and performance standards which were developed by the DEP to ensure that the public is both aware of and involved in the planning for remedial actions that will be proposed at Conway Park. So that's the very basic explanation, and our consultant team with Weston Sampson will explain it in more detail in just a minute. But before we get into Weston Sampson's explanation, I wanted to touch on a few more items. There were 3 city councilors who have been involved with the project, or at least aware of things that have been going on in the project. Ward 2 Alderman J.T. Scott has been very involved from the beginning. He sent me an email earlier tonight that he has a conflict. He's required to be at a different committee meeting where they have to have quorum. He will try to get here for the second half of the meeting if his first meeting breaks up. Alderman at Large Stephanie Hirsch also had another committee meeting, and Ward 3 Alderman Ben Ewan-Campbell also had a different committee meeting. So they all 3 sent their apologies, and I'll catch up with them later, and they'll have access, obviously, to the video that we're making tonight of the meeting. So I'd like to introduce a few other folks. With regards to Conway Park, specifically on terms of the city staff, I am the project manager. I'm Arne Franzen, Director of Parks and Open Space, and the project manager for the Conway Park remediation and the future park development. Also on our team is Vital Deshpande. Vital is the environmental coordinator for the city and is the contact person for PIP questions or Conway questions with regards to what we found out on the site. So we'll have that information for you as well in terms of those contacts. And Denise Taylor is over here. Denise Taylor is with the city's communications department and has been very helpful in terms of getting the word out to the city in terms of where the park is, what the process is, in terms of getting the community emails out, maintaining the Conway website. So thank you, Denise. Also, we've got several other partners in this project. At the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, because I just wanted to call you out a little bit. Eric Johnson is not here tonight, but he is the project manager for Conway Park. He's been a big help, and had several meetings and met on site with him numerous times. Also is Steve Johnson. Steve Johnson is here. Steve is Eric's boss, and Chris Pyatt is here as well. Thank you guys for coming. Also at DEP, helpful people who've been helping have been Joanne Fagan has been helpful, and Karen Stromberg, who leads the PIP process and helps coordinate the PIP process, has been very helpful in both providing guidance for that, and we want to thank that team. At the EPA, we've got a couple of people we want to recognize as well. Kim Tisa is the EPA PCB coordinator. Kim, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's great to have you here. Also at the EPA, people who have been involved in the project on one level or another have been Gary Lipsum and William Lovely, so we wanted to thank those gentlemen as well. We've also been in touch with the DCR. The DCR operates the part of Conway Park that is not city property, the ice skating rink side of the park, and Rob Lowell is the project manager for the work that's going on their half of the park, and we've been in touch with him and working with them as well, and wanted to send our thanks out to DCR for their communication. So those were my introductions. I'm going to ask George Nasselis when he starts his presentation to introduce the Weston Sampson team. Been remarkable in terms of what they've been able to do in terms of moving this project forward. Let me see. So Conway Park is been the city's most important recreation field for a long time. It is in fact the only full-size recreation field that the city owns. In terms of like its use and its needs to the city are vital. So it's critical that we get this park cleaned up and fixed and put back together again as soon as possible. And we count on our partners in the public to help us with that. This project started when we were planning for the renovation of the park. We knew that it couldn't, that the field itself needed to be renovated. We knew there were a lot of things that were associated with the construction of that field that had to be addressed. Key among them was a retaining wall along one side of the park. And so this process sort of started when we started looking at that collapsing retaining wall. We wanted to see what was behind the wall in terms of footings, and we did soil testing both behind the wall and around the field. At that time, we knew that the future park, for example, was going to have a lighting system, so we wanted to see what was going on with the soils for those light posts. So we had borings around the park. We know that the properties adjacent to Conway Park have had a questionable history. It seemed prudent to test the soils while we were out there, and so we brought Weston Sampson on. Weston Sampson has a contract with the city to do that sort of work, and we took a look at the soils. We saw things which we were not happy with, both elevated lead content and we saw PCBs in one sample, a little bit of a surprise. And so we then closed the park and wanted to do more testing. We've done that. We've been out there a number of times for second rounds, third rounds of testings, and George will talk a little bit more about the results of that and where we are. And we had the first community meeting, I think, in March 2019, and our second community meeting was, after we did the last round of testing, we had another community meeting in December 5th. To provide the community with an update in terms of what we had seen on the site, locations, depth of material on the site, and then we sort of talked about what our approach would be. And that sort of brings us up to tonight. So, George, if you're ready, let me hand off the mic.
This is a PIP meeting. Are you going to start from where you left off at your other meetings?
No, I think that, we're going to address the PIP process first, and then we can provide an update on the work that's happened since the last meeting afterwards.
So are you illuminating what you went over in those meetings you just cited?
We're not reviewing everything that's been discussed to date, because I think that would take.
Well, because those were not PIP meetings.
That's correct.
So people who are on the PIP.
Yeah. I think we'll be able to address your questions about the PIP in just a minute.
No, I'm just trying to understand if
Sure.
you're not going to give us certain information because you feel you've already given it.
I think we'd be happy to recap with everything that's been happening. Let's start, and then if we have a couple of questions that come up during the course of the meeting, I think we can answer them. Otherwise, if it starts to get into a lot of questions, I'd like just to hold off until the end of the meeting, if that's all right. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lon. As Lon said, my name is George Nasselis. I'm a licensed professional with Weston and Sampson Engineers. I have two colleagues with me, Prasanta Bunia. We worked together over 25 years. Prasanta's an environmental engineer with Weston and Sampson. I'm sorry?
I didn't understand her name.
His name, Prasanta Bunia. And with me is Marie Ruderman, who is a risk assessor with Weston and Sampson. As Anne did a quick introduction, I'd just like to cover the agenda. We're going to talk we're going to have this meeting in two parts. We're going to talk about the public information plan piece first, that process. Then we're going to go over the information collected to date. So I think that will answer your question. And then we'll talk about new information that has not been discussed before in the public setting. And then we'll get into sort of the anticipated remedial approach and talk a little bit about next steps. So a little bit about the site history for those that don't know. The site dates back to the 1800s. It was a bleachery, and the dye works was established in the late 1800s, and that operated until the 1930s. Early 30s it closed. The bleachery and dye complex took over most of the area that is currently Conway Park. The buildings were demolished, and a field, we first found the first reference to a field somewhere in the early to mid 40s. The city acquired the property sometime in the 40s, we believe, and the fields have been renovated a couple of times, in 1976 and in 2001. What we don't know is what happened between acquisition and when the grade was brought up to where it is today. We don't know the timing of all that. The site is regulated both by Mass DEP. It's regulated under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. And for those that don't know, under Mass Contingency Plan sites, the owner hires a licensed site professional, in that case that's Weston & Sampson, to do the oversight of the Mass Contingency Plan MCP response actions. The site is interesting because it's also regulated by EPA, and that's because of the presence of polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, and so it's regulated under the Toxic Control Substance Act, TSCA. And as we've been working through the process, we've met regularly with Mass DEP and EPA so that everybody's on the same page regarding our approach to this project. So let's talk about one of the purposes of today's meeting, which is to present the draft public involvement plan. As Arne mentioned, there's been a couple of outreach meetings already about the site. First in March of last year, and then a second meeting in December of last year when we had done some work, and we're going to recap that work today for those of you who weren't at the previous meeting. There are also regular updates on the Conway Park website, and Denise can talk about that in a little bit. Back when this started, we got a petition from petitioners to make this a public involvement plan site, a PIP site. We received that in May of 2018. However, because we were just getting into the site investigation process, the site wasn't eligible to be a PIP site until March of 2019. 1 year into the process, that's where we had where we filed a phase 1 initial site investigation and TIP classification. So at that point, the site became eligible to be a PIP site. We sent letters out to petitioners on April 12th. That was revised because we had a couple of addresses that needed updating on the 17th, and some subsequent letters asking for input, specifically asking for input on May 10th and May 20th. And the reason we solicited that input was we want to be prepared for this meeting. We wanted to hear about concerns. And then today is the meeting to present the draft public information plan. We have some copies, hard copies at the back of the room for those who would like to take one. And the actual plan is up on Mass DEP's website. So what is the PIP process about? It's really to create a mechanism to allow for, to solicit input during and to inform the public of the cleanup process. Through this process, we establish a mailing list, we establish information repositories, and I'll touch on that in a minute, and we notify public ahead of time of upcoming major reports. So, and when we're coming to our next deliverables, the people on the mailing list will be notified of these upcoming reports. Draft reports will be made available for review and comment. We'll present the draft reports to the public, and there'll be a public comment period just like there is for this PIP, and we'll address the comments afterwards. This process continues. It continues through the life of the cleanup actions and terminates when the project is closed out, or if it's deemed that from the petitioners that they have enough information and they don't want to continue with the PIP process. But importantly, this is a PIP site, and so as we move through the deliverables for the project, we'll be making those available to the public and presenting them to the public. Denise.
Hello, I'm Denise Taylor from the City of Somerville. I'm responsible for making sure that the information that needs to go to the public gets out to the public and is put in the repositories. I just wanted to step up and make sure that everyone knows how to contact people involved with the project and how to stay up to date. So Arn did introductions at the start. Just want to point out again that Vital Deshpande is the point person for the PIP. If you have any particular questions about the project, you can direct them to him. You're also welcome to contact Arn Franson, our project manager. All of their information is up as well, and it's also on the website. And if you have any questions about the information sharing, you're welcome to contact me as well. We did create a joint email address for the three of us to make it easy on folks. So if you're not sure who to address your question to, you can just email pip@somervillema.gov. Also want to make sure that everyone is aware that we have an official PIP mailing list that is being put together. So if you have not signed up for it, please sign up in the back and write clearly. We also currently have our unofficial email update list that we've been using since this process started. There's about 100 people on that list, and we're happy to add anyone onto that as well, and we send updates through that as well. And the Conway page on the website is another place to check regularly. We'll also be using that as a digital repository. That's not required for the PIP. The libraries are physical required repositories, but we're also putting everything online to make it easier for people to access. So you can check there as well for the digital content. And if you want to make sure that you're aware of any other meetings related to this, it'll of course go through all those official channels, but we also put this in our general city newsletter that goes out, so you're welcome to sign up for that too. And you can sign up at somervillema.gov/subscribe.
Are these screens online?
This whole presentation will go online, as well as the video, and all of the information will go in an update on the page.
Thank you, Denise. So we presented, we prepared this draft public information plan. Copies are available for review. There's some hard copies at the back that we mentioned. We have hard copies at the Central, West and East Branch libraries, where we've established a repository for information for the project. And it's also up on MassDP's searchable sites, and the web address is there. In fact, everything that's in the public record for this project is on that website.
For those who don't know, the West Branch Library is actually under renovation, and so we are using the TAB building, Tufts Administration Building, as it is a temporary location of the West Branch Library.
Thank you. So there's a comment period. We're here, part of this meeting today is to present this PIP and receive comments on how you, the public, would like to be informed. Does this work for meetings? Do you prefer other venues? What times do you like? And so we're looking for comments. There's a comment period that runs through June 19th, 2019. We'd like comments sent to Vital's attention, as we mentioned earlier. And then we will take those comments, we will address them and finalize the PIP, and we'll complete that process by July 19th of this year. So the other piece to the PIP is talking about future mass contingency plan submittals. You will receive notification in advance Folks on the mailing list will receive notification 14 days in advance of the availability of the draft documents. The draft documents will be put in the public repositories. There'll be a public meeting similar to this to talk about that particular deliverable, and then there's a 20-day comment period afterwards. And again, once we receive comments, we'll address those comments and the reports will be finalized. So that concludes the discussion about the PIP. So I want to ask the folks in the audience if you have questions specific to the PIP. We're going to move on, if not, and we'll talk about the data and where we're going with the project. But I did want to pause and offer up this moment, see if there's any questions specific to the
This is a
PIP.
PIP meeting, so I don't know what you mean by questions specific to the PIP, but this here, is this something we can read in these books? What's on the screens?
No. What you have there is the actual public involvement plan document for your review. And that describes the things we just talked about, where the repositories are, how to contact folks, which documents will be available in the future. And what we're looking for is comment on that document in case there's some things that you feel that are being missed. And we look forward to receiving those so we can improve the public communication process. Okay. Yes, sir.
I just had one quick question, which is, once the project is started, it's in this PIP process, is it in the PIP process for the life of the project, or could it eventually come out at some point?
So the cleanup of the site is regulated by both DEP under the Mass Contingency Plan, which has set deadlines, and also we're working with EPA because it's duly regulated. What the PIP process does is add an overlay of making sure that the public's aware of the major milestones. So what that really does is the next major report we'll produce will be up and be reviewed by the folks who want to be involved in that process, and they get a comment. There's a comment period. That process stays alive in parallel with the cleanup process. Once we've filed the final closeout report, then that's the end of both the response actions that are required and the PIP process.
Okay. And one other related question, which is, have you found in your experience that projects that are part of the PIP process take longer, or?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
They do, because there's an inherent delay in each of the milestones, on each of the deliverables.
Okay, thank you.
Because it's open to, we have a comment period post presentation of the draft reports addressing those comments, and they do add time to the process. Yes.
Okay.
The other way it can be terminated if the petitioners that originally petitioned decide they're getting enough information. They can say, well, we don't really need the PIP process anymore. We're being informed.
Okay.
So that is an option.
I think that the PIP, the information that's available at the repositories is all the information that we've discovered today. So all the results of all the lab, the soil tests, everything that we have so far is available.
So yes, what we have are the reports that have been uploaded to Mass DEP. We haven't put some of the latest.
That's quite a bit of information.
That's a lot of
So
information.
if
Hundreds
I
of
go
data points.
If I go to the library, what am I looking for?
You're going to see currently the phase 1 initial site investigation and tier classification report, and that didn't get uploaded, didn't get put there today because there's like 4,000 pages of lab data. So we ran into a production issue, but they'll be up tomorrow, and then a copy of the draft PIP, Public Information Plan, and then as additional information becomes available and finalized, it goes in the public repositories. And as we said, new reports, draft versions of the new reports will be made available and put in those repositories too. So we wanted to talk a little bit, for those that haven't been at the last
I have a
meeting.
question.
Sure.
You sent out certified notification. Did you also send out a letter,
Sent 3 letters,
not certified?
certified.
did you send out a letter, regular mail, not certified? Because the certified document doesn't say it's Somerville, or it doesn't say it's related to this or anything.
I'm not sure what you're asking.
So I've been to other PIP meetings in the past, and they would send out a certified and a regular mail letter, almost as courtesy. I'm asking if you did that.
We send out certified mails.
No regular mail.
Only certified,
Right.
only certified, we only send certified.
Because-
Numerous certified mailers,
Yeah. Three.
only certified.
Three certified mails.
Right, and like I said, they don't indicate anything as to whether it's Somerville or whether it's PIP or whether it's your
Yeah,
office.
it does. Yeah, in the,
Well, no,
in the
not
title
on
of the
the,
letter.
not on the paper, that, the little pink paper that they, little small thing. Like I said, in the past, the other LSPs would send out a courtesy mailing as well.
It's
So
the
that
same
way,
letter.
it's the same letter, but that way people who might not make it or who might not find it urgent can see, you know, in a more busy lifestyle, what the letter is.
It's, we can certainly consider that going forward. You know, if you would prefer to have a regular letter.
You can do your
along with
certified and a regular mail.
I don't think that's
Yeah.
a heavy lift for us. We can do that if you prefer.
Yeah, we welcome any comments on how you'd like to receive communications. Some people like email, and for some of the original petitioners, they had provided email. So, however you would like to receive information works for us. Any other questions on the PIP? Okay, we'll move on to the findings. So we presented this in December. This will be a recap for some folks, but I think it's important that we go through it if you've not heard it before. The investigation started, as Arne indicated, with looking at the rear corner of the site, specifically the southern corner over here, looking at the area by Allen Court for the where we had the retaining wall. And in that sampling, we found we did a disposal characterization sample to plan for cleanup and to plan for the construction project, and we found one sample with PCBs, which was surprising. We went back and then collected approximately, I want to say approximately 30 samples across the site looking for lead and PCBs, and we found PCB concentrations and lead concentrations across the site, including the playground area, which we define as this area here, and we call this the northwest corner and the southeast corner of the playground, and the ball field. So we differentiate between the two. We differentiate between the playground and the ball field because they have different exposures and different uses. So as soon as we found that information, the playground was closed, it was winter time, the ball field had not been used since the previous fall anyway. Since that time, we kept those closed for a while, and we went out and did an extensive drilling program. We advanced borings at approximately 110 sampling locations. We collected soil. We installed some groundwater monitoring wells, collected groundwater data, and we did some concrete sampling. We discussed this approach both with DEP and EPA, and through that process we collected approximately 700 soil samples. We did a depth integrated approach, which means we looked at the superficial material in approximately the first half foot, and then the next foot, and the next foot, and the next foot. And as we got deeper, we increased that increment to 1 or 2 feet. And we also collected samples from the concrete area, in the splash pad area, and also where the adjacent to the ball field. So it was a pretty comprehensive study. This just kind of shows the site layout. I put 2 cross-section lines through there. So what we have at the site, which kind of matches what we thought based on the site history, we have an area of historic fill overlain by more sandy native material. And what we see is the thickest area of fill is in that southern corner, and it thins out as you get near to the playground. It's my karaoke song.
May I apologize?
That's okay. No problem. So, Marie, do you want to come up and help me discuss the data?
So, as we said, the PCBs, we separated out the data into the playground area and the ball field area. We looked at the playground area, and we actually kind of delineated it this way from the northwest area and then the southeast area. The northwest, yes,
Yeah,
northwest
that's what
area
yeah.
had concentrations of PCBs that were less than the method 1 S1 cleanup standard for residential use. The highest concentration there was 0.21 milligram per kilogram, so less than 1 milligram per kilogram, which is the cleanup standard. Because the concentrations of PCBs and lead across this area, the concentrations of lead were essentially at background in this area, we were able to open up the northwest portion of the playground.
And there are a couple of other issues there that we looked at. We looked at how this area was finished. This area of the site has mulch over a geotextile fabric, and then we were collecting the data. Before that, we did also test a couple of the mulch samples. So we felt very confident that this area could be open to the public, and it was opened, I think, last fall. In this area, we looked at, we found low concentration of PCBs. Marie ran some risk numbers to see, how folks may have been exposed. Maybe talk a little bit about how a risk assessment works when we're looking at these types of exposures.
Yes. So when I do a risk characterization, I'm looking, when I'm doing a risk characterization, looking at the potential health risks of any receptor that may be at this site. And in this case, I did a park visitor, as well as a maintenance worker and a construction worker. And of course, because a park visitor can be a child, and I assume that it's a child from age 1 year old to, I think it's 30 years, that's the most conservative receptor out of the 3 that I evaluated. And I assume that the child park visitor is at the site 3 days per week over a period of time throughout the year for 30 years. And when I did this risk characterization using even the maximum concentration within the playground area, there was no significant risk associated with exposures to soil containing the PCBs. However, there were a couple of samples that were a little higher. There's one that's 5.1 and another that's 4.5. So we've kept this part of the south part of the playground closed as we decide what we might want to do with some of those higher concentrations.
And we're going to talk a little bit about the plan for the playground. So as we mentioned, it was reopened to the public in the fall of 2018, and currently the southeast portion remains closed for now. So we also looked at the ball field because there was concerns, people had concerns that they had kids who played at the ball field, and we did a similar type of evaluation. And I'm going to go through the distribution of contaminants in the ball field in a minute, but maybe Jordan, you just give a summary and then I'll get into the isoplex maps.
Sure. Yep. So in the ball field, the concentrations of both PCBs and lead were higher. We looked at the various strata. You can see here it's 0 to 0.5 feet, so 1 less than 1. and then 0.5 to 1.5 feet.
I'm
When we
not
looked at,
saying-
pardon?
I don't see 1 point.
Right here. So 0 to 1.5 feet, 0 to 0.5, sorry, and then 0.5 to 1.5 feet. That's the soil depth. These are what we found in the strata. So you can see in the 0 to 0.5 feet, the concentrations of PCBs, the max concentration was 26. And then there's the distribution there. Yes,
The first bullet there, do you mean to say that the PCB concentrations decrease with depth?
they
No,
increase with depth.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
So so as you can see here, actually, if you just look at the max concentrations, you can see that in the shallowest strata, the max was 26 milligram per kilogram, and it goes all the way up to 40,000 at 7.5 to 9.5.
But it does decrease beyond that, so
Yes.
it's not very clear what we mean by that. As you get through the fill,
I see.
It
After
drops
you get
off.
into the native soil below the
yeah,
fill.
Right.
yeah, so I will
Right.
clarify that, thank you.
Right.
for that point.
So I did run some risk assessment numbers. I used the same receptors that I had done with the ball field, and that's a park visitor, a maintenance worker, and a construction worker. And at the 0 to 1 foot strata, I did a human health risk characterization as well as an imminent hazard risk characterization. There was no significant risk and there was no imminent hazard associated with the concentrations in that 0 to 1 foot interval. However, as you got deeper into the soil, when the PCB's concentrations got higher, there was the potential for significant risk. Of course, what people are mostly exposed to is that top foot. So that's why it's not an imminent hazard, but that's also why we need to do the cleanup.
Yeah. So we were trying to answer a couple of things. We found out we had PCBs and lead in the fill. We were sensitive to concerns about people whose kids have played there, and so we wanted to answer an immediate question, and that was the purpose of once we had all these data, to do some data analysis and to evaluate whether those samples from the superficial soil, what we're calling superficial soil, had posed a risk. But as you can see, we've got pretty high numbers, so we'll just show some graphics real quick here of kind of the contaminant distribution. So this kind of shows 0 to 0.5 feet below grade. White is good, non-detect essentially, or less than 1. The blue shading a little higher, yellow, and then the orange as we increase. But as we go down, you'll see a change in pattern here, and this is quite significant for as we try and understand where the contamination is. So again, this is just taken from the points that we had. Obviously, we don't have a point in every single piece of the field, but this is how you do an investigation. You kind of build a picture of what we have.
I'm
So-
sorry, but you said yellow is higher? Yellow and gold is the highest?
No, red is the highest, and as you can see on this picture now, we start to see a bullseye of red in the southeast corner. Around that's more of a orangey brown color. So these are just showing gradations.
Well, which is the gradation? How does it,
So the red is greater than 50 parts per million, and that's a regulatory threshold. So we wanted to identify where we had greater than 50. We had the orange was, I think it was, orange was 25 to 50, I think.
I don't see orange.
This is orange.
Yeah, right
This
there.
is
That's
yellow.
orange.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so what does it say?
thank you.
Better.
Yeah.
It's washed out on the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And the blue and the yellow?
So,
Go ahead.
okay, so the yellow is 5 to 10 part per million. And the purple is less than 1 per million. So these are, and of course the white is non-detect. So these are very low concentrations, less than the method 1 standard. It's purple.
And what we're trying to show here is where the distribution of the contaminants were. So if we go a bit deeper, we start to see most of the field, we don't see anything, but we do see an increase of higher concentrations in this southeastern corner. We continue, it seems to be concentrated in this area, and as we get past 9.5 to 11.5 feet, we start to see it disappearing. And this is important, again, because we're trying to understand where is the contamination, how much do we need to clean up, where do we need to clean up, do we need to dig up the whole site, is that even feasible? So these are the discussions that we've been having. So this brings us up to the meeting we had last December. We presented that information. In January of this year, we did a geophysical survey to look at that area where we had the highest concentrations. So a geophysical survey, for those that don't know, is we use remote sensing techniques to try and see below grade without digging, essentially, is what we're trying to do. And then we followed that up recently, just a couple of weeks ago, with the test pit program to look at the areas where we had high concentrations from the assessment program and where we found anomalies on the geophysics. So I'm going to talk about those two, and then we'll talk about the remedial planning and conceptual design that has been an ongoing thing since the fall of last year. We focus primarily on this end of the field around the southeastern corner. We did a day of geophysics. We used multiple techniques, but this was the area of the site we looked at. This was the area of the site we had the highest concentrations. And we wanted to see if there was buried material that could be a source. So we used a number of techniques to look below the ground. Each technique is good at some things and not so good at others. Some of the techniques are good to find metal objects, some just show anomalies. This is an electromag survey, which looks at electromagnetic differences. And what you can see basically are the red blobs, and the other blobs indicate that there's something buried down below grade. The next slide is a GPR, ground penetrating radar, and this is good for detecting metallic objects. And we saw some good correlation between the previous slide and those anomalies and the GPR. So based on that, we concluded that yes, there's something buried down there. Using the geophysics expertise, we concluded, and they concluded, that it didn't really have the signature of a tank the way you would see. The GPR is quite good at showing, a rectangular tank or buried drums, something with angular edges. So we kind of concluded going in that we probably had buried debris of some type.
Could you just confirm what part of the park is this? I'm not
Yeah.
100%.
It's that area down there. It's the southern end of the park.
Closer to the tracks.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And we focused on that area because based on the earlier assessment, that was where we had the highest concentrations. Okay. So then, recently, we went out and did some test pit excavations. We did a couple of days worth of work. We started in the middle of the field here. We did a couple here, and we gradually moved into the area where we had the anomalies in the geophysics, and then we hit those areas last. And the reason we did it in that sequence was we wanted to get a feel for how the field was constructed. In this particular area where we didn't see as much contamination, and then we wanted to move towards the area with a higher contamination. And there's a couple of reasons for that, not least of which is you don't want to cross-contaminate, so you go from lightly contaminated or no contamination to the higher contamination. We had a really good contractor. They were out there. They had everything on plastic. They decommed between each test pit. They actually did a really good job. I was very pleased. But what this shows is kind of the typical profile that we saw in the middle of the field. You can see the soil at the top, the organic layer, underlain by a clean-looking, sandy-colored sandy layer, and then we get into layering of the historic fill. And we saw this throughout the central part of the site. As we moved, this particular test pit was, I believe, was this one here. I was actually out for this one, and we started to find buried debris, brick, and some foundations. So this was one where we pulled out a ton of bricks, and we got down to a base slab, and we managed to pull that up, and you can see that clear patch at the bottom. That was whatever soil was below that slab. So we think this is residual foundation from the dye works at this particular location. Then we moved into the area where we had the metal anomalies. And I don't have all the pictures, but I've just got a handful to show you. This was one of the things we pulled out. Looks like a crushed container tank of some description. It wasn't huge, but crushed up. It's probably about 3 feet across. This was one of the things we found. We found this mystery object. We're not sure what it is. DP was actually on site with us. Prasanta was out for this particular day. We think it's electrical equipment of some description. We're looking into it to try and understand whether these are some type of capacitor or some kind of electrical equipment, but that's what we believe it is. It's highly weathered, and in that particular bucket or two, we managed to pull out quite, as you can see on the picture, we pulled out a bunch of these pieces. So a couple of other types of equipment. We found corrugated metal, we found some pipes. This thing is a cylindrical, it could be a tank, but we think it might be something like a hydraulic piston or something like that. It kind of looks like that. But again, when you pull these things out of the ground and they're weathered, you don't always know what you're looking at, but we think this is some sort of hydraulic piston. We also find, as I mentioned, some corrugated metal and some quite a bit of just metal debris. So in some ways it vindicated the model that we had. It confirmed that where we had the highest concentrations and where we had the anomalies on the geophysics survey, we found this variety of metal debris. Some of those, especially what we think are electrical components, could have been the source of PCBs. So it doesn't give us the whole answer. It doesn't point the finger and say, right, this came from here. But at this point, when we're looking into it further, but it does vindicate or it does corroborate our model that we think the source of the PCBs was not from the dye works because of the timing and everything else, but more likely impacted fill containing materials such as I just showed you.
What about the smelting facility?
So the smelting facility operated on the other side of the MDC rink. You're talking about Bay State Smelting.
Mm-hmm.
That operated on the other side. We've looked at their closure documents, and unfortunately they don't have much in the way of PCB information. But from what we can tell, and I'd love, if you know different, that would be great. What we can tell, their operations seem to be primarily on the other side of where the rink is. So we've no information whether they did operations in this end of Conway Park, or if they dumped material here, we don't know. But it was a junkyard type operation, so we could speculate, but we don't know. So this is what we found. So we started looking at development of remedial options back last fall. We wanted to understand the data distribution. We wanted to look at the regulatory requirements, both under the Mass Contingency Plan and under the PCB regulations, to make sure that whatever end we got to was protected for human health and the environment, that we removed any potential ongoing sources, and that's why we wanted to do this test pit program. And we always knew it would be some sort of combination of excavation and then a cover or a cap type system to prevent exposure. We looked at a number of options. We did a preliminary design for where a field would sit elevation wise. Would it be raised up? Would it be at grade? We looked at a whole bunch of different options for thickness of clean cover at the top, clean fill. We looked at how much soil we would need to remove to basically get to, do we remove what's greater than 50? Do we go down to lower levels greater than 10? How much soil would we need to remove to get to 1, which is one of the regulatory endpoints. And that's essentially removing the whole field. And really, when you start to talk about that level of removals, it's something that's not really feasible and would have a lot of trucks going through the neighborhood, and that's something you've got to balance. So every option had a different cost. We met with EPA and DP in February and in March, and we kind of looked at these options together to try and say, well, if we took out, where we ended up was, if we take out what's greater than 50, basically the red bullseyes that you saw, to get to those, you have to take out additional soil. You can't magically remove material that's 8 feet down without removing the soil that's above it. So we looked at, does all that soil go? Does some of the superficial soil, can that be reused? And we kind of came to a conclusion that that was a doable project. It's not easy, but it was doable. And we kind of paused at that point, and then we looked at different cover systems to eliminate direct contact. And the cover system would be the new field.
Whose decision is it doable?
Whose decision? Well, it's a combination of cost, impact to the neighborhood, what we have to do to meet the regs.
But whose decision is it?
That's a combined decision of the environmental professionals in the room. There's a number of ways we can get to a cleanup goal. At the end of the day, we have to demonstrate no risk. Okay, so we as the environmental professional work with the client to show different ways we get to no risk, but we also meet with the regulators so that everybody's in agreement that this is a feasible approach, and for this type of project is probably the right approach. But every option has a different cost. So the city has to commit to that also. So they're obviously a partner in that decision too. Then the third aspect is, if you think about a 2-door filing cabinet, pretty small. It's about, cubic yard of soil, 1.5 cubic yards of soil. That's probably about 2 tons of soil in one little filing cabinet. So you start to think about multiplying that over the area of the field. Each truck probably can take 15 yards of soil. So you start to think about how many trucks and the impact. So there is a balance between how much you do and then how much you continue to do. It becomes a point of diminishing returns with a greater impact to the neighborhood. So we evaluate all those, and that was part of these ongoing discussions that we've had. So that kind of concludes what we've done. There is a desire to open the splash pads. So this is the concrete area of this southeastern portion of the site. There's a desire to open the splash pads. We've tested the concrete, and the concrete, didn't have PCBs. So from a regulatory and exposure point of view, we concur that that could be opened. Working with the city and the regulators, we feel it would be prudent to keep access limited to the grass around there. So we're looking at ways to do that. Do you just put a fence and say, okay, kids, have at the splash pad, or do we do some sort of interim cover? And we haven't decided that, but I know there is a desire to open the splash pads. I don't want to speak any more on behalf of the city, because I know that's a decision that, you know, we're coming to. The other piece we talked about with EPA and DP is, does this project fit under their emergency removals program? That's a program that EPA has to get at sites where there is an exposure risk, and honestly, which can be cost prohibitive sometimes to communities to address. So in the second meeting, we met with the emergency removals and emergency response folks, and we kind of posed the question, is this a potential site you could work with the city on? And if you do, is that something that EPA would do as a service, or would it be something they would come back to the city for cost recovery on? So we're in a point right now where those discussions are going on. The city solicitors are talking with EPA and seeing if it's a fit for that ER program, if it's not, and where the cost recovery question, if that can be answered. Because if it can, then EPA would conduct some of the removal actions, which would be great from the city's point of view, if it's a fit. If not, then what we'll need to do is go through a remedial design, bid, build type program. No matter what, before we get to whoever's doing the work, there'll be some sort of release abatement measure, called a RAM plan under the Mass Contingency Plan, and or a risk-based cleanup plan, which is the likely way we'll try to close out this site, and that's where we're going towards at this point. And those plans would be one that would be under the PIP, would be available for discussion and presentation and comments. Once we get agreement on that, how we're doing that, then to complete closure, and really probably for your question is, when are these fields getting built? We got to get through design plans and specs. Now again, if EPA is doing the work, it may move on a faster timeline, but you know, an excavation plan, dewatering, what are the endpoint targets that the contractor's got to meet, dust and site controls, environmental controls, transportation routes, all those good things that any large project like this needs to address. There'd be construction admin and oversight, some closure sampling, how many samples do we need to demonstrate that we've got no significant risk, and then with the goal of eventually ending up at site closure under the state and federal regs. What I think where we're going to end up is a remediation contractor, whether it's EPA doing the work or a bid contractor doing the work, will get the park to where it's ready to have the field area reconstructed. We wouldn't go with a field contractor trying to do remediation. That just wouldn't work. So the goal would be to get this to a point where, okay, we've cleaned up the worst of the soil, we've got some sort of fabric down as a separation barrier, and then maybe some ballast down, and then the field contractor can come in and do their work in an area where they know it's clean. So that includes clean corridors for utilities and for foundations for light poles and things like that. But that's a ways away. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, that the goal is to get through the remediation first so that the field contractor can come right on the back of that.
What is dewatering?
Dewatering is, so if you hit groundwater in an excavation, you can't dig in the wet. You've got to get the water out of there somehow. So you can't just, pull it out and
It is a
dump
high
it.
water table. I don't know if it's high or low, but the water is,
We saw it, I think, in a couple of test pits about 8, 9 feet or 10 feet down. It's not particularly high.
well, it's 5, I thought it was about 5 feet at 5:15, some of the lab, and they had quite a bit of flooding in the building on the other side of the tracks when they put in the garage underground, which they
Okay.
don't allow anymore. So I thought it was higher than that, but.
It may be that because the field's elevated,
Yeah.
that we go down farther
Well,
before.
I'm not arguing on it, I'm just, it's a high
Yeah.
water.
Well, we do have groundwater wells around the edge, so that's part of the design, is understanding and planning for how you manage groundwater. Now, we think we won't have a lot of it to deal with, but we may have some to deal with, so,
Is the splash pad where the kids go for the sprinkler, the fountain?
yeah.
Okay.
But that's in the playground area, again, different exposure scenarios.
But somebody said it was a couple of high exposures there. This woman said there was a couple.
Not in the concrete area,
Yeah.
no.
None of the concentrations were above a concentration that would cause a significant risk.
You said 4.5, 5.1.
There's 5.1 and 4.5 there. Those are the two ones, that's why we're talking about maybe covering that one area or putting up a fence.
When you look at the data in aggregate around this end of the playground, if you look at an average, you look at potentially could be exposure or a statistical analysis, the concentrations are below a standard that we care about. But that's, despite that, so far we've kept the site closed. And what we're saying is if the kids come into the splash area, we're going to still restrict access to where we found those concentrations. Because, it'll be the right thing to do.
Yeah, we're being cautious
Yeah.
because it's little kids that are in that area.
Steve, you had a question?
I do, more of a comment, George.
Yeah.
With respect to the remedial approach,
Yes.
one thing I wanted to point out was the specifications, the design of any kind of cover or cap could be influenced by how much of the PCB you excavate and remove.
That's right.
So to the degree that you remove more of the PCBs, then that there's less concern or less need to meet, the specifications would be reduced to some degree about the level of the capping material.
Right. Thank you.
I didn't get that. Maybe I'll get it later.
Well, what we're saying, in a nutshell, some material is going to get removed. The question is how much material. And the more you remove, the less material remains that's impacted with lower concentrations. But no matter what, however we do this, the superficial area where people can be exposed to, that's going to be separated by some sort of cap or cover system. So however we leave the site, we have to ensure that future people that play the park, future construction workers, that nobody's going to be impacted by what's left behind. Any comments? I think. Okay, so summary. We reviewed the site history and the regulatory overview. We discussed the PIP and the PIP process. We talked about the data that we collected before and the update with the new information, and I discussed the next steps. And I really welcome any questions that anybody's got, and thank you for asking as we go. I appreciate that.
So PCBs, is it only dangerous when you touch it, or vapor, or?
Well, we are lucky to have in the room the PCB expert, but may I start and then tell me where I go wrong when I go off script. Generally, PCBs tend to stick to soil generally. So your route of exposure tends to be either touching them or inhaling dust, or touching them, then eating your sandwich because you didn't wash your hands, or that generally is the route of exposure. for this type of PCB.
So inhaling dust, does the PCBs go to the top of where the grass is? I mean, are they up there?
No, we haven't seen them in the top of the grass. No, in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to show that profile picture where you saw the grass layer over the sandy soil before you got into the darker material. But most of the ball field, that top foot area was white or blue on those plans, and that's what you're seeing. So you don't see anything in there.
The other areas where they were red and orange?
So the red and orange the red print was all deeper. Can it get up into the roots? We've kicked around why you might have some PCBs near the surface. The only thing we can think of is possible, I don't know, was stuff moved around as this was filled? I don't know. It's generally not uptaken by grass, right?
I haven't seen a lot of it in grass. I mean, there are some systems like vegetables and everything that it's
Right.
grown with the roots. And sometimes frost heaves,
Right.
you have a lot of movement because of frost heaves. You could have a little bit of movement of soil,
Right.
but it's good that this has been there a pretty long time and the surface soil isn't showing a lot,
Right.
if anything.
And I
Right.
did evaluate thermal contact, incidental ingestion, and fugitive dust, inhalation of fugitive dust.
So Park is a very windy
Sure.
passageway there.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to understand, because there's a lot of dust around there. Some of it's from the train,
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
I'm not saying
no.
all of it's from,
Right,
but
right.
there's, so we're talking about PCBs, we're not talking about, something much less. So are you saying that in the dust, there's likely no PCBs flying in the dust because there's dust flying there?
So what we're saying is from Conway Park, because of what we've seen in the surface, there's likely little to no PCBs in the dust. But what we're also saying is based on how one is exposed to dust, based on the evaluation we did with conservative assumptions, that we don't see a risk. But when I talk about dust exposure, one of the key things, that's why I put it up in the construction documents, is how you manage dust during a construction site. Anyone who's seen a construction site knows contractors are great, they generate dust. So how do you control that? And that would be very, very important once we get into the cleanup. And it talks to sequencing of how much of the field you open up at one time so that you can minimize dust emissions. You've got water on site to wet it down. You've got foam on site if you need to use it. All those things come into really site controls that are very important on any cleanup, whether it's PCBs or anything else. So it's a really, really good question. Yes, sir.
So does the conceptual schedule also have a conceptual completion date at this point, or is that still TBD?
Yeah. So, no, and I know that's why you're here. It really depends on which route this goes, whether removals takes the lead on doing the cleanup, or if it has to go through, approvals of the risk-based cleanup plan, and then through a typical contractor design bid build process. That second process will be slower, and we're trying to get an answer fairly soon. The city's solicitors are talking with EPA about, is this a fit for the emergency removals program or not? It could be a great bonus to the city if they're prepared to do it, but only if they're prepared to do it and then not say, well, now you owe us the money for that, because then that will be more complicated, and that's not really a benefit to the city taxpayers.
What do you mean by design bid build? Build?
Yeah, so any public project over a certain amount has a design phase where you design the project and put in contract documents, you bid it, you put it out to bid, to tender, any Brits in the room. you put it out to bid, and then, you evaluate the bids. It's a publicly bid project subject to public procurement laws, and then you select typically the contractor with the lowest price.
You're talking about to remediate or to
I'm
build?
talking about to remediate the field. So I should have said maybe design, bid, remediate. But any public project, that's the process. So inherent in that are delays. You bid the job, typically a bid period, 30 days. You select the contractor, you come under contract, you look at their submittals, you confirm that they're qualified to do the job. There's no, outstanding warrants for the owners or something like that. And then they come in and they give you the schedule. So the public bid process is a little different. If Emergency Removals decides that this is a fit and they will do the project, I think it could probably be accomplished quicker, but I don't want to speak for EPA because we don't know their, and I'm not putting Kim on the spot either, we don't know, A, if it's a fit, B, they'll do it and see where that fits in their hierarchy of projects that they've got on their plate right now. Yes?
Because I guess maybe I'll morph my question into a comment as well, which is it's strange to me that there aren't scenarios that have timelines. Like I understand uncertainty. If you do A, then time B. If you do C, then timeline D. But it's strange to me that it's just stuck in an amorphous void of, well, we'll eventually get some bids, and that could be 25 years from now, or it could be, so I'm a little bit, it's funny to me because this would never fly in the private sector, right? I'm trying to imagine going to a client, I can't really tell you if I will ever get your project completed, but.
There are
Deadlines.
Okay,
that's helpful then, so maybe, where are the deadlines and the timelines?
DEP's deadlines was 1 year to do your initial site investigation, and that was met. And then it gives 3 more years to do with a comprehensive site assessment, which includes a risk characterization.
Okay.
And then after that is another year to do the specifications, the design, and then another year to close. So it's a total of a 6-year time period for hazardous waste sites. But we also encourage, and we have vehicles like this term that was used up there, the release abatement measure.
Yeah.
We have ways to get things cleaned up sooner. We encourage sooner cleanups if they're feasible.
So that's helpful. Are those, I know there's a lot of documentation out there, are those dates available somewhere in the public record and all that?
Yeah, it definitely is.
Okay.
There's, if you go to DEP's website, it talks about the Mass Contingency Plan process, and there's some fact sheets about the timelines and the requirements under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan.
Okay, so so if you put all that timeline together, roughly 6 years, is that, I'm curious, when did the clock start? And therefore, looking back on that, what's the completion date that this project has to be done by?
Clock started in March of 2018, which is when they notified that they had concentrations of PCBs and lead above our reportable concentrations.
Yep.
And then the 1-year deadline to do the initial site assessment was March of 2019.
Got it. And then you mentioned the other, so there's what were the years then after that for project completion? It was like a 3-year period and a 1-year period?
5 year, well, after the first thing, it's still 5 more years. So it's,
yep.
The site characterization and risk characterization has a 3-year period. And these are timeframes that we based upon a number of, looking at our universe of sites as a whole. There are some really complicated sites, maybe Superfund level sites, that will not get done in 5 years. That will take many years after that.
Yep.
And then there's other ones that can get assessed and cleaned up and closed out in less than a year. So we have a window, and that we kind of set the timelines, the deadlines on what the average site might take.
That's helpful. So then roughly it's March of 2024 is when the project would have to be completed.
That's right.
Okay. And then I guess the other question I had is...
Well, just to say, we hope it's done a lot sooner than that.
I guess that was going to be my next question, right? Which is there transparency around what the variables are that could actually accelerate progress, and how are those decisions made? And like, that goes back to the original question I asked, right, which is this PIP process. Like, how much does that impact the 6-year timeline? And if it gets out of PIP, does that help? Like, I'm curious as the cost-benefit trade-offs and how transparent those can be made to the public in terms of, here's how we could do it faster, but, you know, here would be the trade-offs of that.
Well, a lot of times, the main factor in terms of how quickly things can get done is the money, the finances.
Okay.
And so we don't yet know how this is going to be financed. George has mentioned that EPA's removal program may get involved. That could expedite things quite a bit.
Okay. And is it just who's paying for it, or is it also you can pay more to have it done faster?
Yeah, well, the ultimate cost is going to be the factor. So you've got to figure out what it's going to take in terms of the actions, what those actions are going to cost, and then where we're going to have the finances to do that.
And for a project of this size, duly regulated, complicated, we've actually collected a ton of information in that first year, way more than a normal assessment. We're quite a ways through this project where we have a pretty good understanding of nature and extent of contamination. Sure, there's holes. We don't have a data point everywhere, but we've got a pretty good understanding. So we're at the point now of getting into the planning for the cleanup, which normally would be done a few years in. We've already started that process. But we need some certainty. We need to know that if we do this, will everyone agree that we're going to get to closure, okay? Because otherwise you start and, oh no, we need to do this, no, we need to do that. So that's been where it may seem a little amorphous, but it's kind of an iterative process, and it's talking with DEP and talking with EPA about this is what we're thinking. Do you see any problems with this approach? Then when we have a good idea of our end game, we talked about what are our end points that we need to get to, then we can develop a set of bid documents that are tight. Because contractors, if we come in and say, yeah, we're going to dig up some soil here, have at it, then we don't know. And of course the city has to appropriate funding to cover all of this. So we need some numbers that are pretty good for an engineer's estimate, so the city can budget. And then once we know that, we can generally put a time frame to it, recognizing you always have a winter shutdown typically. So your season, if you start in the fall, can you get through it all in the fall, or is it going to continue in spring, or is it just better wait until spring and starting then? Those are variables. But so to Steve's point, we're getting towards, we understand what that end game can be. Now we're looking for an alternative funding source through EPA, which would be great if it works, but we have to plan that it may not. If it doesn't work, we go through the traditional design, bid, cleanup process. We would approach the city and say, this is what we think it's going to cost. This is the schedule. The city, of course, would need to fund that somehow. So then there's competing, I'm not a resident, so there's competing interests within the city. So,
right.
I don't want to speak for the city and put it, that's why we didn't put dates up there, because we're at a point where we kind of have an idea, but it could go in two different ways.
I can't speak for the mayor's office, but I can tell you this, that as a project manager, this process has gone forward at a very steady pace. So it's like trying to find out what the initial information is, exploring, getting the next round of information, getting the next round of information. Each course of testing leads to new questions, and so we've been working to get those questions answered. And I think that we are at that point where we have a very good idea of what the conditions are on site, which is the point we've been working towards. So now it's figuring out the next steps. I think that while there is this very long potential timeline for the project, and while we don't want to be in the position of saying, yes, it's going to be completed by this date, I would say that the city staff has pushed the agenda. We've pushed, Weston Sampson to get, the data back to us as quickly as possible. They've been very cooperative. City Council has been very cooperative and very helpful. I think this is a priority for them as well. I think nobody wants to be in the position of saying, nobody wants to hold this project up. Everybody, it's had the green light from the very beginning, and I think that's the way it's going to continue.
I think that's helpful, and I think maybe once more just a comment, right, which is whatever time is appropriate in this process, some transparency around options that are being considered with the associated, trade-offs in completion time versus cost versus other factors that are being considered. I think that's just a helpful input into the public dialogue as you continue to get input.
I think that is at the point we're at now. It's helpful to have the information from the ground penetrating radar, and then the last course of testing. So,
Yep.
so we can see what's there, and that's going to help us decide which way we want to go. And then in our conversations with EPA and DEP, how they would advise us as well.
Okay, thanks.
Do you live on the park?
Nope.
Sorry?
No.
I was just curious. I have two quick things. One is, you said you had other pictures. Is there a way we can see those? You said you had other pictures of the metal.
We can put together a representative photo.
Yeah, maybe next time when we have a meeting, you could put them at the back of one of these booklets or something? I mean, I don't know.
Well,
What's your, I'm open to.
sure. I mean, it wouldn't go in that booklet. That's the public information
No, but
plan.
I thought you'd give another booklet next time, maybe.
Sure, we can pick out some, I mean, we have pictures. A lot of them are not that interesting. They're dirt. But, so
Okay,
what
I
we...
mean, I don't need like duplicates, but I'm just trying to get really more of a sense of what's under there. It's a big park and we just had to usage it a lot, so I didn't know if.
Probably got about 50 pictures.
And are they of other metal pieces?
A couple are, but most of it's, and we haven't done a formal test pit log of this picture with this test pit, but we can pull that together. That's.
I mean, I'm not trying to make you just do
No,
frivolous work.
no, I
I'm just
understand
trying to get a
that.
sense of,
There are a couple of pictures that have other material that was excavated, but what I showed tonight, I thought was the most interesting.
what specifically I heard, and I don't know, I have no facts to base this on, that there was a transformer? Or some kind of a,
We don't know whether there were transformers there. Transformers are a source of PCBs, so are other types of electrical equipment like capacitors. We didn't see a whole transformer down there. We found a bunch of metal debris. We found some of those strange-looking small objects that we're looking into to understand they're clearly electrical equipment of some kind. Were they small transformers or capacitors? We're trying to understand that.
because you were digging in the, I think it would be the south, this corner, but.
We dug all through that
So-
area there.
Oh, you didn't, because I saw you digging near Park Street, to the bottom.
We dug, well, I can
Right-
show you,
right there,
we
right
dug all
there.
over the site. I mean, unless you watched the
Okay,
whole.
I saw,
Started center,
start at the center.
and then went to the back.
Go to the right, and then coming down. I saw you digging there.
Yeah,
And so I guess I was told that there was something there.
Okay, I
and
don't know who told you that.
I didn't know if it was transformer-esque or something.
I saw some of those pits, and we didn't see anything like that. The thing that I noted in those pits in the middle
Yeah.
were that we went through a couple of layers, and then we hit what were the foundations of buildings. So like a
Yeah.
concrete layer where you would then break through the bottom of the building to the material below, and just sort of like, it was suggested that that was where the old Bay State, the
Dyeworks.
bleachery
yeah.
buildings had been.
So this was typical of a number of test pits in the central part of the site, typical profile. So I have a lot of pictures that kind of show them pulling back the turf, going down a couple of layers, different close-ups of the type of dirt and the different pits. I chose this one because I thought it represented nicely the typical layering we see in the middle of the field, where, using the term clean, we have the root layer over this cleaner looking sand over this darker material. You can see there's some brick and material down there. And I mean, this is common historic fill that we see below that. And we saw that across the site. I chose this picture because I was there for this one, and we saw, this was the second or third where I saw a lot of bricks. To Arne's point, this was probably the foundations from old buildings from the bleachery time. And what was interesting was we pulled up the base layer of brick and there was some concrete. And we got into that cleaner looking sand that you can see at the bottom. So that was interesting. It just kind of gives you again an idea of what the type of material. And then we got to where the geophysical survey was, where we started pulling out debris. Councillor Scott, you haven't seen these, so I thought it'd be worth going through them again. This was something, we didn't see anything like a big tank or anything like that, but this is kind of looks potentially like it could be some sort of crushed, maybe a small crushed tank or something. It's clearly metallic. We saw this was interesting, and we're going to try and understand what these were. Possibly electrical. Is that wire wound? Is it paper? There's a thing called paper transformers that we're looking into. We're trying to understand what these were. If anyone knows, we'd love to hear from you. So this came up in one of the areas where we had the anomaly and where we had the high concentrations of PCBs. We didn't see petroleum. We didn't see oozing black soil. We didn't, you know, sometimes you see petroleum associated with PCBs. We didn't see that. But again, you know, we did a limited number of test pits. You know, you do what you can to try and understand what's there.
When they say ground penetrating radar, isn't that a way of doing?
Sure.
And you followed the sign?
Yeah. So where we had the boring data that showed high concentrations, and we went out and with a big bit of white marker marked the areas where we had those anomalies, those things that you saw on the ground penetrating radar signal and the electromag signal, and we dug in those areas. So that's where we're pulling out things like
And
this.
can I just confirm, did these things get removed?
We say some of them, most of them got put back in the hole.
Including the ones that might have PCBs?
We kept a couple of those. I think the rest, did they go back in the hole, Priscilla? Yeah, we put everything back where it came from.
And they may just stay there?
No, when we do the cleanup of the site, which is the next stage, we're obviously going to come back and address all those areas.
This wasn't a site, this was a test, this was not a site cleanup.
Yeah.
So it was just a
Right,
test.
but I just didn't know if it made sense to take them out while you were in there.
Well, we had a limited budget to go in and assess. We didn't have a disposal budget, especially when you don't know what you're dealing with.
Right.
So, you know, had we found something that was full of oil, that would have been a different situation. We would have addressed it there and then.
Can you go back to that colored map? Because I
Sure.
was wanting to get a sense of what addresses related to it.
Which, this one or the?
No, you had like,
These
you
things?
called it orange and
Yeah,
blue
sure.
and, yeah,
these-
that map.
Yeah.
So you've got these lines at the bottom. I'm not sure if they're indicating buildings or,
This is these?
Yes.
That's the property line. That's the retaining wall.
so you talked about Allen Court. Can
Yeah.
you give me a sense of, on this, where that
Yeah.
is?
Yeah, sure. This is Allen Court. Comes up there.
The two lines are the,
That's Allen Court.
that's the court?
Yeah.
And
So
so,
this would be right up here.
okay, so that's Allen Court.
There's Allen Court, and then I think there's a building to the right of it, and then there's the yellow building.
Where's the yellow building? It's on Allen Court, is the yellow building.
There's lines here showing the outline, I believe showing the edge of the building, so I think that would be Ellen and Eileen's house. And I think that would be your building.
So where the orange and the yellow go is where we'll call it the yellow house is on Allen Court.
Okay.
And then the next building. So that yellow, what is the concentration of that yellow?
So again, it's interpreted concentrations between what we have in the bullets, and that's greater than 5 and less than 10. So what we're saying is we have data points and we interpret between them that this is sort of the range of concentrations there. It doesn't mean that at every point that's what you have, but that's an interpretation. Now you have that elevated retaining wall, and as you know, there's what, 7-8 foot grade difference between Allen Court and Conway Field. So all that material is behind the retaining wall. It's at a higher elevation.
In this image, we're looking at,
Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
it goes down to 1.5 feet below field grade.
Below the field grade.
All right, so what happens when we go down 5 or 6 feet? Or, you know,
Yeah,
just take it
that's-
down deeper?
Yeah, so 5.5 feet, 7.5 feet, 7.5 feet now we're getting down to.
So now we're down towards, now we're near the bottom of the wall.
Yeah, 11.5 feet. Yeah. Now we're around the bottom of the wall, so it's non-detect, which is the white, and, sorry, the blue's blue purple's 1 to 5. Yeah, yeah.
So you're saying that the further you go down, the less there is, but that's not what you said earlier.
So it really depends. This is why that was not a great, it depends where you are in the field. As you can see, at this depth, most of the field, with the exception of the area up against the DCR rink and that little bullety area, most of that is clean, what we're calling clean. But you also got to look at the superficial concentrations. We've got a lot of white, we've got a lot of blue. I know there's yellow and some orange, but we've got a lot of white and a lot of blue. When you continue down, what we're starting to see is it increases in the area of the red, but other areas of the site, the majority of the site is cleaner with
Do you
that.
have this map going down 7.5 feet?
Yeah, right there.
Okay, so you're saying there it gets less.
Yeah. Well, based on the data points we have, sure.
Can I mention something?
Yeah.
The highest concentration you have, the 40,000 you mentioned earlier, is at a depth of 7 to 9 feet, 7.5 to 9.5 feet,
Right.
okay?
Right.
So, you know, it seems like it's going, it's getting higher with depth, but I'd also point out that not over 90% of the other samples you collected from the 7 to 9 foot depth were non-detect. That's what's from your table, from your,
That's right.
I don't know, your November or December letter report.
Right.
Okay, so you did get one really high concentration
Right.
where that orange, where the red is.
Where the bullseye is, where
But
we
the 90% of them were non-detect.
right.
In the worst area at the back, we saw the concentrations increase as we went down. For the
Okay.
majority of the site, the concentrations, you know, were less. as
And
we
these
went down.
maps are going to be online and we can get them?
These maps are online. They're part of the Phase 1 report that was submitted March 29th, and hard copies should be in the library tomorrow. Yeah.
I think-
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a good planning tool. It's a good, kind of shows you where we need to focus the remediation efforts, okay?
What does the DEP say about the numbers? I know you throw out 1, 4, 5, 50, 44,000. I'm not sure what the rules are in terms of.
Okay, so I'll speak for DEP, so George doesn't have to. So we have two ways of looking at cleanup values. And one is method 1, where we don't ask people to do a complicated risk assessment on simple cases. You know, they don't have to hire someone like Marie over there to do a risk characterization. You just look at the numbers that we have posted. It's called method 1. Again, sorry for all the
No.
jargon and everything. And you compare. So our method 1 cleanup value is 1 part per million, or milligram per kilogram, okay? And that's for accessible soils, so it wouldn't apply to soils down 7 and 9 feet. It's accessible soils. The top 3 feet is what we consider to be accessible or potentially accessible. There's another way to look at the cleanup value if you have a more complicated site, and that's to do what's called a method 3 risk characterization, where you look at how much frequency of exposure and duration of exposure occurs. And so if you have a isolated media, whether it's groundwater or deep soils or soils beneath a building, something that is less accessible, then you could actually have a lot higher levels and still be considered safe and closed.
With a risk use limitation?
You're talking about activity and use limitation?
Yeah.
Yeah, if we're leaving stuff behind, most of the times, at higher than our method 1 levels, most of the time, an activity and use limitation is needed. I kind of simplified that explanation rather than get into the details.
I think you're saying that you're gonna figure out, depending on what they want to do with it and other variables, what has to be done to make it safe?
Yeah. That's the gist of it, really.
Kim, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think that's the process, really. We look at it a little bit differently. We don't look at just the top 3 feet. Our numbers kind of extend from top to bottom regardless of where it's located. But we would still go through that same process in terms of assessing risk and looking at different alternatives such that we can make that risk not of issue, but also weigh what all of the other items are, which would include cost, the impact to the community, which is what George talked about. So a lot of these alternatives that we're talking about, certainly the agencies want to see more details on what the various alternatives are and what those costs would be before we make a determination on what makes sense for this site. We have not put anything in writing to say that this is what the remediation will be. We have talked about it. We've talked about what the cost could potentially be, given what would have to be removed, what the final covers could be constructed of, what soil could be left on the site after it's put back in to get to the higher stuff. So a lot of that are details that certainly will still be submitted to the agencies. But those are all considerations and things that I think will be discussed at these PIP meetings. That's what we have asked. That we want transparency. The agencies certainly want transparency here, and going through that and discussing what those options are and kind of what the pros and cons are should be part of the process. So that's what we're hoping will come out here.
Any other questions? Councilor, any questions, or do you want to follow up?
I'm happy to follow up afterwards. I'm sorry I couldn't make it down here earlier due to the License and Permits Committee, but I appreciate you bringing the information. I had requested copies of the slides earlier today while they were still under construction. Hopefully I'll get all those.
Sure, absolutely.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming out tonight. Appreciate it. Good questions. So that helps us a lot. So thank you. And thanks for coming. All right. Thank you, George. Please, our meeting.